Utah is going to fall short of their goal of three-peating as Pac-12 champs. Where did this season go wrong? We're talking about it on today's Locked On Utes.
You are Locked On Utes, your daily podcast on the Utah Utes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for making Locked On Utes your first listen every single day. We are available on all platforms, including YouTube and wherever you may get your podcasts. If this is your first time listening to our show, make sure you like and subscribe. We'd love to interact with you guys in the YouTube comments. You can follow our show at Locked On Utes. Today's episode of Locked On Utes is brought to you by our friends at LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. You can post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnCollege. Terms and conditions apply. My name is JT Wistrcill, former intern inside the University of Utah Athletic Department. And on today's show, we're talking about Utah's health, what could have happened if Utah had stayed healthy this year, and also talk about Kyle Whittingham's post-game press conference comments, the Monday press conference comments. But first, I want to talk about just where did the season go wrong for Utah. And yes, most of you can probably guess what that is going to be, but still, there's a couple other reasons outside the obvious one, the elephant in the room for Utah. But look, this Utah team coming into the season, when we look back on August, this is a team that had a lot of excitement and hype coming into it. They were hopes that Utah could not just three-peat as Pac-12 champs, but I believe Whitt and the players even mentioned college football playoff aspirations. How could you not be when you return so many key players? You've won the conference in back-to-back years, and seemed like you were in a good position, even though the schedule was a gauntlet on paper. You're like, this is a team good enough to reach the Pac-12 championship game. And I think at their full potential, they would have been a contender right now to make the college football playoff. It would have been interesting to see how those games against Oregon and Washington would have gone. We don't get to know because we saw them, Utah, not at full strength. And that is the biggest thing for where did this season go wrong for Utah? It's with the injuries more than anything else. Obviously, chief amongst them, the injury to Cam Rising. The other injuries, while very costly, don't compare to losing your starting quarterback. It's the most important position on the field. And, if you do lose your starting quarterback, you would be helpful to have everyone else healthy. That's where the injuries just became too much. But a quarterback the caliber of Cam Rising covers up several warts. If you have negative plays, it's a lot easier to overcome them when you have a top 10 quarterback in college football who has led you to back-to-back Pac-12 champs, who's shown the ability to make plays under duress. We've seen Cam Rising have the game he had against USC last year, not once, the first time being really impressive, the second time being still a very strong and just exceptional performance too. But the only reason Utah was in it the first half against Penn State was Cam using his legs and just finding a way to make plays. Cam's a winner. He makes things happen. We've talked about it so many times on this show about Cam doesn't show up in SportsCenter top 10 for all these crazy highlights and throws like a Caleb Williams does, but he makes winning plays time and time again and finds a way to get it done for his team. Utah really missed that this season, whether it was just how slow of a start the passing offense got off to, or in particular, just how many games in general the offense was one-dimensional, whether it was just a failure to move the ball through the air, even the ground game, having a quarterback like Cam helps the ground game a little bit. Bryson's done a good job there, but I still think the threat of Cam's legs or something, because it's not just the threat of his legs, it's the threat of him running while also knowing like on the move, Cam's more accurate than Bryson. And Cam on the move is a lot more scarier because he does a better job keeping his eyes downfield, even though Bryson has grown and gotten better at that than a Bryson Barnes did. So yeah, the biggest thing for Utah this season going wrong is Cam missing the season, but it's of course the other injuries as well, because Brant Kuithe would have had a chance to be right up there for one of the top tight ends in college football this season. And maybe not even far behind him, we thought might have been Thomas Yasmin. When you look at the big plays that Yasmin had last year, I don't know if there was a tight end in college football a year ago who had a more impressive highlight reel. Like if you're talking about his best 5 plays, obviously we know Laporta from a year ago, also talk about Dalton Kincaid, like those guys were better tight ends, but you give me like 5 or 6 plays of Thomas Yasmin, I think they're as impressive as any plays those guys had. It's the totality that those guys and the resume overall that Kincaid, Laporta, Brock Bowers always, of course, put together. That's why they would be above a Thomas Yasmin. But Thomas Yasmin, you thought like, okay, he'd have a chance to do some special things. He didn't get to finish the season out. He got hurt as well, as we know. Losing Lander Barton defensively, who maybe played his best game of his career against USC. That's what Kyle Whittingham was quoted as saying. He goes down. Then not even that. It's Mekhi Bernard, an elite receiving back out of the backfield, who also does a good job in pass protection for you and is a tough runner and was coming off a really good game against Florida too. So no Mekhi, you even get a proven veteran in Chris Curry. He gets hurt. Micah Pittman was one of the offseason additions we were really excited about for this team, and we felt like would have a chance to do some things. And he gets hurt as well too. Whether it's the offensive line having to be shuffled around because Johnny Maea isn't healthy to begin the season. There's issues there too. Then you get a guy like Logan Fano even who begins to pop and he gets his ace and then the injury happens. That's where it's brutal. And he was going to have a fantastic season. Fano was, I felt like too. And this pass rush would have been even better, even though I think they've done a good job. So injuries are the biggest reason that Utah failed to three-peat as Pac-12 champs, but they're not the only reasons. Let's talk about some of the other ones. The QB situation was botched for Utah. I think we were all, very much so myself included, overreacting to how Bryson looked against Baylor. And it was a bad performance, but I think Utah should have stuck by him and given him the Weber State game to get right, let him build that confidence back up so he would play. And Bryson's played very well at home, so we know he would have played well against UCLA. He would have played better than Nate did in that game too. So that's where I just feel like the QB situation was botched. And I'll say this about Nate as well. I don't feel like Nate was put in a position to succeed always. We talked about it during the Oregon State game. Nate did not have a designed quarterback run called until after he was benched. Bryson came in, Bryson got hurt, and then Nate was put in the game. Then they called a designed quarterback run when they were already down 21-0. Like, Nate's best skill set is still his legs. While he can make some plays with his arm, we saw he's much more effective with his legs. We literally just saw that against Arizona State again. So that's where it's disappointing that they wanted to limit Nate because, yes, he did have some fumbling issues. But once again, that's just playing conservative, scared not to lose. That's exactly what that is when you are not allowing a player to do his best thing off the fear of what might happen. And that's what Utah did with Nate Johnson. And that was really unfortunate because potentially if they had rolled with Bryson Barnes just all season and stuck by him, or maybe even like just let Nate do whatever Nate wanted to, it still probably would have been a loss against Oregon State with Nate in there. But maybe with Bryson in there, maybe Utah finds a way to win in Corvallis. Really difficult and tough and probably doesn't happen, but they would have had a better chance with Bryson Barnes operating that offense because the offense is Bryson was the best backup on this roster for Cam Rising. Nate's skill set are different and the offense didn't really change enough to match his skill set too. So yeah, whether it was botching the QB situation, playing conservative, as I mentioned, just playing not to lose, and then the injuries, the biggest thing by far. Those are the biggest reasons to me that Utah failed to three-peat as Pac-12 champs. But look, what would have happened if Utah stayed healthy? I think that's a big what-if question everyone is asking. And look, the 3 losses Utah, so this is still a really good team, right? I mean, the 3 losses they have are all the top 12 teams. By the time later today, you guys will hear, and we will all hear the college football ranking show. I think Oregon State's got a good chance to be in the top 10. So Utah's 3 losses could all be to top 10 teams. It shows you how good this team could have been. So if it wasn't for the injuries, what would this season have been like? That's what I want to discuss in one moment. But first, I want to talk to you about one of the sponsors of today's episode of Locked On Utes in our friends at Jase Medical. We spent a lot of time talking together, you and I. We get fired up together on wins and losses, who starts and who sits. I'm thankful for that connection we have. And today, I want our chat to be a little more personal. I just learned that you can get a 1-year supply on ED medications. You realize what that means? Bring on extended travel, bring on the next natural disaster or supply chain issue. You are covered, my friend. You don't have to worry about whether or not you can refill your generics for Cialis, Viagra, Revido prescriptions, and this is possible because of our friends at Jase Medical. You can go online right now at jasemedical.com to receive your 12-month supply on your daily medication. Remember to use promo code LOCKEDON at checkout for a discount as well. A verified customer had this to say about Jase. I am thankful for this service. Supply chain issues caused me to cut pills in half to have it. I ordered most of my daily meds with a year supply. I also ordered an antibiotic kit, and I feel secure now with Jase. Prices are lower than local pharmacies. I highly recommend this for everyone. If you or someone you love would get the peace of mind by having a year's supply of any daily med, go to jasemedical.com to see if it's offered to you. Remember to use the promo code Locked On. That's all caps, no spaces, Locked On for $20 off your purchase. All righty, coming back into this one, let's talk about Utah. A what-if scenario, shall we? What if Utah had stayed healthy? What would this season have been like? Well, for starters, Utah would, of course, still been undefeated going into the Oregon State game. I think the Florida game would have looked uglier for the Gators because Cam Rising running this offense in which he's comfortable. I think they would have had even more success than they did. Then the Baylor game as well, taking on a backup quarterback. I think Utah would have looked more dominant against them. We know they would have taken care of business against Weber State. And as good as UCLA defense has been, and they got beat by Arizona State this last week, but especially just throughout the season, they made a number of nice defensive plays, and they lead the Pac-12 in many defensive statistics, at least last time I checked, but still towards the top regardless. Utah would easily scored over 20 against UCLA when they only scored 14, and one of those being a defensive touchdowns. Then we look at the Oregon State game. With the way that game played out, where the Utah defense played well overall, yes, they gave up 3 touchdowns in that game. That's not bad to a top 12 team, which right now Oregon State is. And once again, think they're going to be a top 10 team by the time this podcast releases 24 hours ahead of when that comes out. That's a confusing timeline I just gave, but I think you all know what I mean. By this time later tomorrow, by the time I'm recording this at nighttime, so by the time tomorrow night rolls around, either way, I should just move on to the next point I'm trying to make. Anyways, so yeah, Oregon State game for Utah. I think this is one that I do think they would have won with Cam. I just think the defense, anytime you can hold a team like that to just 21, they got beat a couple times, but I think Cam would have really risen up in this one for Utah. One of the biggest things to remember about this Utah offense is it's not like Devon Vele forgot how to get open, run routes, all that things in the first half of the season. Bryson, Nate did not do a good job of finding him out there. And that's just disappointing that Vele came back and wasn't utilized properly until the last couple weeks, because he's been making plays and getting open on the season. Utah just hasn't done a good job going to them. And I should say that definitely is on Andy Ludwig some too. It's not just on the quarterback, and obviously offensive line needs to protect, and they need to do a better job of holding up longer in protection, because that's been something they've also struggled with throughout the season. So I do think Utah, based on how that game would have gone, there were throws to be had. And there were some drop balls, but in general, like Cam's ball placement is going to be better than Nate Johnson's was in that game. That's not a debatable fact. And by that point, Cam could have really been 100% healthy too. Like rather than Florida game, he would have been working his way healthy. You would hope that barring any big hits, he'd be 100% healthy. So the threat of his legs also, I think, would have been something difficult for Oregon State to handle. And look, even without Lander Barton and without Logan Fano, and those two became really good players for this team this year, this defense has still been elite and one of the best in college football overall. I still think they're a top 15 defensive unit in college football, maybe even the top 10. The Washington game gave me a little less confidence in that, but I still think they're right in that range because of how many things they do impressively at a high level. So talking about this Utah team more, this is where you look at the defense, like they're still at a championship level. You have Cam in, it feels like they would have beaten Oregon State, and especially because I said, what if Utah stayed healthy? So you know what that also means? Mekhi Bernard. That also means Thomas Yasmin. And of course, that also then means Brant Kuithe. Brant Kuithe, the best pass catcher, the guy everyone predicted Utah to lead receiving yards in this season. As good as Devon Vele's been, they would have been a lethal 1-2 punch, and Yasmin being utilized better because of the quality of the quarterback play would have also been massive for this Utah team. So that's just where, once again, I look and you just think, what if this team had stayed healthy, because they were making so many plays and they would have been in it in some of the big games on the season. And, you beat Oregon State, obviously take care of business against Cal. Cam Rising is owned USC. I don't think that game changes. If anything, Utah probably wins a little more. It's 34-30. That game was 34-32 in favor of Utah. I think Utah usually scores over 40, just like they did last year at home. And this year they go on the road and do it in the Coliseum, which we've seen Washington and many other teams walk in and really give it to the Huskies. Or not the Huskies, give it to the Trojans defensively. So then you get to the Oregon game. Look, the Oregon and Washington games, I don't think Utah would be undefeated at this point in the season if they stayed fully healthy. I think Oregon and Washington are two really good teams. If I had to predict, I would have guessed that Utah would probably lose the Washington game. Even coming into the season, actually, with Cam Rising healthy, I thought that Utah was going to lose to Oregon State. Based on how that game played out, I look back on it now and I go, oh no, I think that Utah would have won that game. I thought the Utah defense would be good this year. I don't think I thought they would be as good as they've been overall, because we all said like, oh, they could be a top 10 unit, but then to really see it play out there, who was talking about Jonah Ellis doing what Jonah Ellis is doing? We all thought Jonah Ellis could maybe be a breakout player. I didn't hear anyone saying, and I think you guys and myself included would have thought I was crazy if I was like, oh yeah, Jonah Ellis is going to have more sacks than anyone else in Power 5 football, and he's third overall in the FBS. I'm like, what? That's insane. And that's exactly what he's done. So credit him. And there's obviously a ton of other playmakers defensively for Utah that have stepped up on the season. And that's where I'm just so impressed. But Oregon and Washington, just such good teams. It's so hard to finish a college football season undefeated. With Cam healthy, I do think Utah probably would have, with everyone healthy, I think Utah would have lost one of those games more than likely. And based on how everything's played out, maybe it's Oregon, because Oregon did have the chance to take their foot off the gas pedal a little late in that game. I mean, it was 35-6, right? So That one probably was another shootout going into the 40s had Cam Rising played. Maybe the Ducks come out on top barely. They're a really good team this year, but I do think Utah beats Washington because the lulls that Utah had in the second half offensively, those don't happen if Utah has Cam Rising in there to me, because he makes those throws that Bryson missed at times. He's able to overcome some of the offensive line struggles, the lack of a rushing game that was there in the second half. Those are what Cam Rising excels at overcoming. We saw him do it against a team like Penn State in the Rose Bowl, and I know he would find a way to do it against the Washington Huskies this past week. So I think Utah, if everyone was healthy right now, would be sitting with just that lone loss, as I mentioned. Just think about how many times where it's like, especially early in the season, it was like, we need some other people in the passing game to emerge. You mentioned Vele, but they weren't doing a good job finding him. If Cam's healthy, not only are all those guys being utilized better, a Money Parks, maybe a Micah Pittman and Cam's connection, I think that would have made a big difference. Maybe Emory Simmons gets off to a better start this season, because we don't see much of him now because he wasn't able to get off to a better start, honestly. And then you look at other guys too. Keithy, just the connection they had together. Keithy, remember, he's the guy who torched Florida for 100 yards in that first game last year. So just look at games like that and moments like that, and it's like, oh, if we would have had those guys out there, those playmakers, the results could have been different. I truly believe this team was capable of contending for a college football playoff spot. I'm not going to be like they're a national champion contender, because it's hard to do that when you see like Ohio State, Georgia, and Michigan. Just they've been on such a different level than everyone in the past. That's where it's hard for me to throw them in there. But why can't they be in a playoff position like an Oregon, like a US, like not USC, we know that, like a Washington? And, honestly, with the way Utah was playing, they would have been right in the thick of this whole thing. I think they would have been one of these teams that's right in the mix for a top 5, top 6 spot, because I do think they'd only have one loss at this point. So that's where the season is. Just feels like a missed opportunity because of how vicious the injury bug that was that attacked this, that bit this Utah team. So unfortunate, but season is not over for Utah. Still got 2 games left against Arizona State and Colorado. Great opportunity for Utah still to get to 9 wins, which 9-3 with those only 3 losses being the top 12 teams would be just tremendous for Kyle Whittingham and co. And I'm very much so excited to see how they're going to do against Arizona. That's what we'll be breaking down the next episodes of Locked On Utes throughout the week, because it's a really good Wildcats team that by the time I'm recording my Wednesday show, that Wildcats team is going to be ranked above Utah, which shows you about the position that Jedd Fisch has them in at this moment. But I do want to talk, before we completely move on to that game, got to reflect a little bit about what Coach Whittingham said in his Monday availability. He spoke about the loss to Washington. I thought he had some interesting offensive comments. We do Witt's Translator on here weekly, where I kind of give you my interpretation of what I think Kyle Whittingham is saying to the media. That is going to be in the third segment. But first, before we dive into that fully, I want to talk to you guys about one of the sponsors of today's episode, in our friends at LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. You guys can go over and add your job to the purple hashtag hiring frame to spread the word on your LinkedIn profile. They are hiring, because there are tons of great candidates out there. And there's these simple tools like screening questions that make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience to quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. LinkedIn Jobs is a site that's allowed me to connect and network with different people in my industry, that's allowed me to form those strong connections that have helped me learn and grow, and also get job opportunities too. It's one of the many reasons that small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs in number 1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people and the right candidates that you want to talk to faster. You can post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's all caps, no spaces, lockedoncollege.com. And once again, that's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions do apply. Alrighty, closing this one out with a Witt's Translator, a shorter media segment today, only 12 minutes long, and not as chatty. I don't think any of us are after a loss, or not an ideal day at the office, right? So Kyle Whittingham, understandably not so as well. He was asked, just what Kyle just in general talked about this a lot, how the offense, just wasn't the same. He said that he gave an interesting answer talking about why the offense wasn't the same in the second half. He said no explanation for offense. He said there was no explanation for the offensive issues. And that's just, and even in his other comments and words, he kind of gave some of the issues that popped up. Like, they know some of them, and some of them are what I'm about to talk about. And I think that, look, if I had I'll say this about Utah's first half offensive performance. It was incredible. In some ways, it might have been a little fluky, just in terms of this. Please show me the half that Utah scored 28 points in the first half. I don't even know if they mentioned that against Arizona State. And if they did, that was against an Arizona State team that was extremely depleted, and it was just a horrible matchup. So that's where it's like, it's just the quality of opponents aren't even in the same stratosphere. I know that one game was close, but that was Washington taking Arizona State lightly. The flu game, Arizona State throwing everything they had at them versus there's a lot of factors either way. So yeah, that's where I look for him talk about the Washington loss. And there are issues and things you can point to in this one that, because in a lot of ways, the first half offensively was fluky. Yes, Utah got called for a lot of penalties. Most of them on the defensive side of the ball in the first half. Offensively was where they started to add up in the second half. Spencer Fano played well in the first half. He's a true freshman starting at left tackle. He's going to have his warts and moments, especially against a guy in Trice and the other pass rushers they have. Some of those guys, Trice being the main one, have NFL futures ahead of them. Spencer Fano, I think, actually is going to be playing in the NFL eventually. He's a true freshman starting at left tackle, though, versus Trice is a guy who could go in the NFL right now and I think would have success creating pressure, and it is going to next season when he does, because he will be declaring in this draft. So that's where I look right away and I just say, Fano was good early on, but whenever you're a true freshman like that, playing on the road against a tough opponent, you're going to get worn down a little bit. And we saw that happen with a couple of those tough penalties and even just freshman mistakes, right? Loud environment, Husky Stadium, you're slow to get off the ball. Boom, defensive end crosses your face and you give up the safety. That stuff that's like, okay, that makes sense. That happened in the second half, that your freshman left tackle played very well in the first, but it's hard to maintain that in the second when you get tired, fatigue sets in against really elite competition. So that's something that paid in. Also, just Bryson in general, he has missed throws all season long. While he did a good job hitting them in the first half, I can't say I'm surprised he missed some. And it's not even just on the last drive, which I've highlighted on the show. There was throws to Mickey Sugacharaga that were slightly off target. Mickey should have grabbed it, but I think Bryson would also say, I got to have a better ball placement there. There was one that was behind Landon King on the very first drive that would have been for a first down, but Bryson threw it behind him. So there were a lot of instances of that too, where Bryson, and under duress, he's never been as accurate. Utah offensive line held up well in the first half. That Huskies defensive line, give him credit, came out better in the second half, and they got a lot of pressure on Bryson. And when Bryson's pressured, he's not as good. A lot of Utah's issues in the second half were self-inflicted, and including poor penalties like the one on Mickey Sugacharaga, which we've talked about now 3 straight episodes, but I also think it's worth talking about and bringing up for 3 straight episodes because it was very, very bad call. So going back though and just talking about this in general, I just feel like it was a lot of good Huskies too. I felt like they didn't play great in the first half for their standards, and they played much better in the second half. And you got to give them credit for, yes, the Utah offensive line didn't play as well in the second half, but that's also because Washington's defensive line played better and forced them to not play as well. So give a lot of credit to the Huskies for doing that up front and getting it done, not allowing those running lanes, getting home with their twists, whether when Fano was out and Tongai came in at the left side of the line, to getting pressure on Bryson. And Bryson missing those throws to just, the running game not able to get going as much because Washington was stronger up front, winning their assignments more. So that's the biggest thing to me for why this Utah offense, as much as Whitt said the first half, there's no explanation for the offensive issues. Yes, it is. I think Whitt, like, you just got beat. And I think Whitt knows that too. And I think he's just kind of like, well, it's weird because we did so well in the first. But I think if we were really to hook up to a lie detector test, he'd be like, he would speak maybe more candidly on those guys not performing up to that standard too, because look, even in some of the games earlier this season, he said things like, he said after the first game, guys played great, but then if you turn on the tape, guys got multiple penalties and, missed blocks, and you're like, that usually doesn't constitute playing great. So some coaches, not some coaches, every coach does this. They say one thing to the media, but then other things are actually true. And I'm not saying I know everything. I'm simply just stating facts of, well, if you look at the history of how they evaluate this versus on what he's saying, those two things don't add up together. And I think in some ways, Whitt's saying that they can't pinpoint the offensive issues is part of that as well. Last thing I wanted to mention was Whitt was asked about just if guys coming back and if they're having those conversations. He said they absolutely are and they have a good feeling on it. I think he's absolutely right. I think whether it's Cam, Brandt, a couple of the other guys that have been injured, I think they know what's on the table, the opportunity next season. I'm sure, NIL plays a huge role in college sports and athletics now, right? So I'm sure that part of it has been discussed as well. If those guys did return, how that would factor into it. That's just, I feel like they probably have a decent handle on what Brandt and Cam are going to do. And a lot of these other guys are going to do as well, because once they said that this conversation has begin as senior day approaches and all that stuff, that they're always in the know and just ready to have those conversations. And I'm sure they have, so I'm sure they know what those guys are going to be doing. And it's going to be something interesting. And that's something that we'll be covering soon on Locked On Utes, is which Utah players from this year's team that I think will come back for next year versus which ones are going to be going off to the NFL draft and trying to pursue the next football chapter. And that does include Brant and Cam. We'll see what they decide to do. And we'll hear from hopefully both of them in the near future on that decision. And until then, we'll be discussing it. But as it pertains to this week, we got some film to break down in Arizona because that's a really good Wildcats team that Utah has to take on this coming Saturday. It's going to be a fun one to break down. Spencer McLaughlin with the Locked On Pac-12 channel is going to be joining us later this week to do so. But X's and O's talk offensive and defensive side of the ball for the Wildcats versus the vice versa for Utah coming up on tomorrow's Locked On Utes. Thank you guys for making us your first listen every single day, and we'll see you tomorrow.